Let's get to Dan Lacalle, the CEO of Tress's Gestion. Dan, just a moment here to reflect on the UK situation and the RPI and the CPI prints we've just seen. Your comments welcome. Any indication here that inflation is starting to top out or peak?
It doesn't look like inflation is topping out. My biggest concern actually is that what begins to be a trend is that core inflation, excluding the impact of energy and food, remains stubbornly elevated. And we have yet to see the impact of the second wave of inflation, because the vast majority of businesses have not passed on to consumers the increase in costs. So the danger is that in the second half of the year, particularly the fourth quarter, we might see another increase in inflationary pressures. And as Steve was just mentioning, very important, is that what we always used as a way of measuring a loss of purchasing power of salaries is above 11%.
So, Dan, what does this mean then? Because the policymakers are woefully behind the curve. Whether they ever catch up to the curve remains to be seen. Inflation will no doubt abate at some stage, whether it's food, whether it's energy as well. But then the different type of inflation, this is the subtlety which I think a lot of our viewers need to understand about, and which I think a lot of the economists refuse to acknowledge, that yes, you may see an abating of this primary level of inflation from energy and food, but that doesn't mean inflation will abate, because another kind of inflation, whether it's second round, whether it's demand from employees, will start coming up the rails, and hence we'll have sticky inflation because it's in the system. That's not going to abate anytime soon, is it?
It is not, absolutely, and you've hit the nail in the head. The biggest problem is that policymakers and most economists are focusing only on the impact of war, supply chain disruptions. Most of that has already been discounted, and it's perfectly accepted that there might be a moment in the next few months in which either demand destruction or some easing will bring the headline inflation down. But that is not the problem. The problem is that policymakers remain massively behind the curve. The monetary aspect of inflation is not being considered enough by policymakers. There is a reason why the UK or the Eurozone have inflation of these types of levels when, for example, Switzerland, with the same exposure to energy risks and supply chain disruptions, has 2.8 inflation, and it's massive increase in money supply well above demand. So central banks and policymakers really have to take into account this and really take action on the monetary aspect of inflation, because if they don't do it, the risk of stagflation is higher, and that is virtually impossible to sort with demand-side policy or with the typical actions of both governments and central banks. So we really have to start waiting. We really have to start talking about the reality and less about the excuses, less about the whether it's something that is temporary, because the problem right now is that we are likely to see a very drastic impact on household savings, on the ability of salaries to purchase the average goods and services, and families are certainly hurting.
Up on that point, I've just had a note in my inbox from a company called Zip Zero, and they're talking about the increase here for a lot of consumers, £380 more on food this year, according to this company, and also energy costs through £3,000 for the first time ever. They're saying this puts more pressure on energy and retail companies to do more, and that's interesting, isn't it? We know the pressure has been on energy companies to try and cap some of these prices, but what about retail? Because every company that I've seen in the retail sector, other than Target in the United States, is effectively seeing margin expansion. Is there a point along the food supply chain, right to the supermarkets here, where we've now gone peak margin and we're going to see pressure on these companies too, not to pass on the cost increases?
Absolutely. Absolutely. We are following exactly the same pattern that we saw in the 70s. First, say that inflation is not a problem. Second, that it's transitory. Third, blame businesses. That's where we are right now. Fourth, we will see blaming consumers. People are hoarding, people are not acting rationally, etc. And at the same time, nobody wants to do anything drastic and real about the elephant in the room, which is massive money printing, significantly above demand. Remember that money supply growth, despite the reduction in 2022, is still running above the levels of quantitative easing times 2009, 2010. So the big problem here is, yes, there will be pressure on retail companies. There will be pressure on energy companies. There will be pressure on businesses because what the political world and maybe the media, sometimes consumers see is prices rise, so they think that prices rise because the retailer wants to increase them. But we are going to see at the same time margin pressure because, as I said before, about 75% of business have not passed the increase in costs to final consumers. So so we really have to take action on the monetary aspect, because the excuses of blaming businesses and blaming consumers are not going to work, as they didn't work, by the way, prior.
Dan, thank you very much for joining us. Dan Lacalle with us, the CEO at Tressis Gestion.